Welcome to the Cambridge Cleantech Special Interest Group, Sustainable Smart Homes. This week we're going to be talking about retrofitting and the new Green Deal. My name is Peter Bates. I have been running my own consultancy for something like 30 years. Roughly, we can talk about that it's all been all about innovative ways of doing things. But something around about 10 years ago, I started getting interested in energy efficiency in the home. And we've decided in conjunction with Cambridge Cleantech to establish this new special interest group called Sustainable Smart Homes. And the reason why we decided to set up this group is that there's something like 27 million homes will require deep retrofitting and installation of renewable energy services in order to meet the UK government's zero carbon targets by 2050. So we were at a critical time in order to try to reduce the carbon emissions from home, which amount to something around about 30% of the overall carbon emissions which occur in that respect. So the Sustainable Smart Homes group will start to then focus on these areas. But today we're going to look at what happens or what's about to happen in the next few weeks with the new Green Deal. But let's have a look at what happened with the original Green Deal. This started something like 7 years ago, in fact, in February 2013. And what I liked about it, it was a new way of retrofitting and utilising a financial mechanism which would enable homeowners and private landlords to take out a loan which could be paid back over a 25-year period through government-backed Green Deal finance company. It was also about quality assurance to ensure the good quality work through a network of accredited Green Deal advisors, Green Deal installers, Green Deal advice organisations and Green Deal providers. But the original Green Deal unfortunately had problems. One of the key problems was that the interest rates were high and also it was complex to get a loan. This resulted in limited access to the loan for those people who needed it, particularly for low-income families. And unfortunately, the quality assurance aspect of it was more focused around procedures and having the correct paperwork, not on the quality of the advice and the installation of the work. And there also was a very little to encourage innovative solutions, whether that be innovative ways of insulating the home, innovative ways of using maybe electrical systems in order to heat the home or various things like that. Anyway, as a result of the problems which occurred, the government decided to set up or appoint Dr. Peter Bonfield, the CEO of the Building Research Establishment, to identify ways of providing clarity and confidence to consumers. This resulted in something like 27 recommendations. And this is the result of what we are now having launched in a few weeks' time, in 30th of September. In England only currently, there will be the Green Homes Grant. Well, actually, this was something which the Chancellor set up as an initiative to try to encourage new jobs as a result of COVID and large numbers of people possibly losing their jobs in that way. But running alongside this for a few years now have been developments towards what's called Past 2035. Now, this is not a new BSI standard, it's a framework for retrofitting project delivery. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to pass over to Andre Miller from the UK government's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. And he's actually going to focus and talk about on strategy and commitments and challenges that the government have to face.
Are going to have to up the effort to meet those carbon budgets, and the upcoming advice from the Committee on Climate Change about carbon budget 6 will have to be aligned with net zero, whereas up to now the carbon budgets have been aligned to an 80% reduction. So what does that mean? It means that fundamentally we have to decarbonize homes, unless we're going to find some magic technologies. And even if we do find some magic new technologies, they are probably going to have to be used to decarbonize things like aviation and heavy industry. So I'm thinking about removing carbon from the air and burying it. You know, there simply isn't enough capacity left if you're moving to net zero to not decarbonize your buildings. So what does, obviously that requires large interventions, and I think politicians are particularly nervous about what that means in the context of homeowners, and changing heating systems is something that I think that they are sensitive to, which I think is partly why there's a big attraction to hydrogen, because if we could get enough hydrogen to use to decarbonize homes, then you know, I think it's politically and from an infrastructure perspective much easier than changing over to electric heating through heat pumps. But that's highly uncertain to sort of be even optimistic around that. So I think it's fair to say that there is going to be a fair amount of disruption in heating systems. And of course, the other thing that a switch to hydrogen won't deal with is the area that I focus on, is fuel poverty, because hydrogen is unlikely to be cheaper than natural gas. So we're going to be in a position where people will have higher heating bills, and certainly that looks the case with heat pumps as well, given the disparity between the price of gas and electricity. So to have this fair transition to net zero, which is again something that the government is focused on, I think we absolutely, unequivocally have to insulate homes. And then the big part of that is, big challenge is going to be who pays. Is it the taxpayer? Is it the bill payer? And what will homeowners, and particularly owner occupiers, accept? Will we, as a nation, accept regulations on us that say that when we sell our house, for example, or when we're buying a house, shortly after buying a house, we have to get it to a certain level? So those are all the sort of things that policymakers, but ultimately politicians, are wrestling. And this is why I think it's a difficult area. And I think part of that is going to be educating the public. You know, as a citizen, what can I do to reduce my carbon footprint? What's in it for me? You know, the greater comfort, health benefits, reduced bills, but also what's in it for society. And I think people don't know about that. And of course, today we're talking about quality. I think quality is a cornerstone of this, because if I, again, as a consumer, think, well, first of all, I don't really know what to do to my home, and secondly, I'm nervous about what quality that is. You know, am I going to potentially undermine the biggest investment I've made in my life to someone who's going to be insulating it for a couple of weeks? So that's absolutely essential. So next slide, please. So what are the key policies? I think I'll sort of go backwards on the slide. So the Clean Heat Grant is going to be the main, well, it was going to be the main support mechanism for low carbon heat, but actually that may be usurped but that's £100 million worth of exchequer funding between 22 and 24. So it's the replacement to the domestic RHI with grants rather than the tariff, the 7-year tariff mechanism that's been in place for the RHI. The energy company obligation is due to end in 2022. It's been the biggest scheme in GB since 2013, but we would like to confirm its extension and potentially its expansion in the next few months as part of the spending review that's ongoing. So although it's not direct government spending, we would like to confirm the future of that and provide that certainty to the sector. And then obviously we've had big news, the announcement of the Green Homes Grant. So this is something that 4 months ago we would not have anticipated at all, and it's pretty much part of an economic stimulus. The jobs and the fast creation of jobs is the #1 priority for the Chancellor. But we've got to use that opportunity to as a launch pad for the future. So from my perspective, what that means is, yes, generating jobs, yes, insulating loads of homes, but also minimizing the problems. And that might sound sort of negative, but actually I mean that in a positive way. If there are lots of issues with quality, lots of problems with people having a bad consumer experience, that could hold back the sector. And Peter mentioned the Green Deal, and this could have sort of similarly negative effect. So I think there's massive potential if this goes well. I think it's going to be difficult, obviously, to spend that 2 billion up until the end of March, and we recognise that, and hopefully there will be some flexibility to deliver beyond that timescale. But certainly the Chancellor is very focused on as much of that money being spent as possible in that period when the furlough scheme ends, and there are expected to be large numbers of layoffs potentially. I'm not going to go through all the detail. Suffice to say, the voucher scheme is the biggest part of the Green Homes Grant, but there is also an element around 500 million that we want to deliver through local authorities, and the first phase of that has already been and gone, in as much as we've got bids in, and we'll shortly be announcing successful bids. As Peter mentioned, the voucher scheme should launch on the 30th, and between now and then we are going to have key announcements, or rather the remaining detail of what the scheme will entail. So on the final slide, please. Yeah, big year ahead. As I said, Green Homes Grant, that the success of that could influence future policy. But the spending review is also a massive moment, because if we get these commitments on eco, the home upgrade grants, which was in the Conservative manifesto, the social housing decarbonisation fund, again 10 years of spending, 3.8 billion. What's going to happen with the private rented sector? We want to announce spending future regulation in the private rented sector. And again, if that's all homes to see within the next decade, that should provide certainty. The future home standard, okay, it's new build, but if there is real ambition in that, we could have innovation, building of capacity, cost reduction, and skills that spill over into the retrofit market. We are going to have the energy white paper, which is going to have a focus on buildings and consumers. The heat and building strategy, that the ministers are committed to publishing that by the end of the year. And again, that's the roadmap to how we are going to decarbonise buildings, and it's going to have to provide some certainty for those near-term carbon budgets, but also set out what is the route map to 2050 and total decarbonisation. We've got the fuel poverty strategy. also, which we aim to publish this year. So that focus on how we're going to take the most vulnerable in society with us. And then finally, you know, it's a massive year. The Conference of Parties, we're co-hosts. It's been delayed, but the next year, the UK is going to have to show real ambition internationally, and in the context of economic stimulus, I think buildings and retrofit hopefully going to be a big part of that. So I'll now pass over to Peter Rickaby, who's going to talk more about the detail of standards. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Andre. I can hardly wait for all that stuff. It's great. I'll just share my screen, if I may. You should now be able to see my screen. Is that correct? Nobody's responding.
Yes, we can see your slides.
Great. Okay, thank you. So my brief this afternoon really is to just tell you briefly about the quality assurance framework that's been put in place as a result of the Each Home Counts review that was mentioned at the beginning by the chair and by Peter, actually. I thought I'd start with that. So let me just move the slides on. You've seen this picture already, but I think the main point to make about Each Home Counts was that it arose from almost half a decade of really poor outcomes in the retrofit industry, including some spectacular disasters. And the result was a complete loss of confidence by the public and by the government in the retrofit industry, which led to the two departments setting up the review. And it hasn't actually been stopped, as Peter suggested, for the last several years. There's been a long process following the publication of the report of implementation. Lots of have been working on it. So industry-led review, 27 recommendations under those headings on the right of the screen, implementation by a cross-industry implementation board. Bayes has put actually probably more than 3 million in now into the implementation process. It took the board two years to work through things, and we've been working on the standards ever since. So it hasn't been paused, it's an ongoing process. What does Each Home Counts do? Well, its objectives were essentially to return the trust of the public and the government to the industry, and indeed to gain the trust of finance bodies who were not really interested in investing in an industry that couldn't deliver good outcomes. So essentially, that was the second and probably the most important of the objectives of the review. I'll just get this to do that. There we go. There is also an implicit objective, which was to encourage the consolidation of our industry and move away from a fragmented measures-based approach and adopt a whole dwelling approach, which we knew technically is far more sound and a far more better thing to do. And we're actually in that process now. The transition to the new standards is essentially about consolidating the industry to deliver a better product around whole house retrofit rather than incremental measures. This is my rather simplified diagram of what Each Home Counts is about. Down the third column, the grey one, is the retrofit process itself, assessment, whole dwelling assessment, including assessing the ventilation, a design process, including an improvement option evaluation, and a medium-term plan for every dwelling, an installation process, commissioning, and handover. Over on the left-hand column under standards, we have the standards which came out of the Each Home Counts review. The consumer charter, which tells customers what they could expect from our industry. The code of conduct, which tells the industry how to behave in respect of consumers. The technical standards, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And all of those three things support the quality mark proposed by Each Home Counts, which is we now know is Trustmark. Trustmark is the quality mark. Those things are mediated in the second column by training and guidance and an information advice hub. And then over on the right-hand side, we have some quality assurance mechanisms, including a data warehouse to which records of every stage of every project will be uploaded, Trustmark's enforcement procedures, which are already in place, and eventually some monitoring, evaluation, and feedback so we can improve things as we go along. And the colors on the diagram, green means we've done it. We've spent the last 2 years doing that implementation. It's now in place. Yellow means it's very nearly there. and red means we haven't got that yet, and we are actually currently looking to fund an information advice hub which is not yet in place. Moving on, the technical standards work stream of Each Home Counts was the BSI Retrofit Standards Task Group. I was the co-lead with Claire Price from BSI on technical standards for retrofit, and I chair this group. It has these objectives. I'm not going to run down them all, but I'd point out to people that those objectives are not all about energy efficiency. There's a lot of stuff about protecting the architectural heritage, ensuring the comfort and well-being of occupants, and so on. And then down at the bottom, we have some principles adopted by the Retrofit Standards Task Group to focus on outcomes and not people, what we do to the buildings rather than certifying some kind of competency, to make standards accessible as much as possible online, and to combine standards with guidance so that they're not just obscurely written documents. And the main output from the Retrofit Standards Task Group, which is about 25 invited experts who've been working on now for 3 years together, is what we call the BSI Retrofit Standards Framework, which I think Peter mentioned earlier. And here is a sort of representation of it, if you like. At the top, we have the Each Home Counts Trustmark Quality Mark, supported by the Code of Conduct and the Customer Charter. In the middle, the big box, is publicly available specification 2035 or past 2035, which is really the overarching technical standard. It's called Retrofitting Dwellings for Improved Energy Efficiency Specification and Guidance. It's the overarching comprehensive domestic retrofit standard. It's really a process standard. It says, if you do things this way, you are likely to get good outcomes. And then it refers to lots of other standards in the bottom row. Existing BSI standards like PAS 2030, BS 5250, BS 7913. Non-BSI standards like the insulation industry's standards, the MCS standards for renewables, and SIBSI's standards. And in the middle, the Retrofit Standards Task Group is working on a whole series of new standards for retrofit, including assessment, air tightness and ventilation, advice, building performance evaluation, and so on. So quite a lot still to come, but PAS 2035 is in place. What does PAS 2035 do? Well, its application is to any domestic retrofit. It's not just for eco or government-funded projects. Anybody buying or sponsoring retrofit can adopt it and require the work to comply with it. It must be used in conjunction with another PAS, PAS 2030, which is the installer PAS, and it requires, as I've said, the use of many other framework standards. For compliance, every single project, retrofit project, must have a retrofit coordinator. And I'm not going to dwell on that very much because David Pierpoint's going to talk about some of that stuff next, I think. But the retrofit coordinator is responsible for agreeing the intended outcomes of the client, ensuring that we comply with the PAS and deliver those outcomes, and protecting the client's interest and the public interest. Something the industry never had before is someone whose job was to look after the householder's own interests. This is I'm not going to go too much through this, but this is a simplistic diagrammatic representation of what the PAS 2035 process is, from inception at the top in the middle through to the end. So it involves a risk assessment of every project, which determines whether the project follows one of three paths, A, B, or C, through the standard, through the PAS. It also determines the qualifications of people who are doing assessment and design work on that project. There is then a whole dwelling assessment, including an assessment of the ventilation system, and if the building is traditionally constructed or protected, a BS 7913 significance assessment. That's all followed by an improvement option evaluation to determine what are the best measures for this dwelling to get it where we need it to be by 2050, and a medium-term plan to set out how we should get there. That's agreed with the client, and then the immediate package of measures goes into a design process, which is pretty demanding and requires things like construction details of critical junctions. It requires attention to moisture management and so on. Once we have a design, the design is passed to the installer, who must comply with PAS 2030, 2019. And that involves installation, testing, commissioning, and handover, after which, when the work is completed on site, there is an evaluation process to check that the agreed outcomes have been achieved and to feed back to the project team anything that's not right or any unintended consequences which may require some remedial attention. I put this in for the colour really. This is the measures interaction matrix, which is in PAS 2035 and PAS 2030, and which helps the designer to determine some of the features of the design. It's I know you can't read it, but it's a matrix of measures against measures. And when you have combinations of measures, the technical risk is higher than that for single measures. So what you do with the matrix is you look up your particular combinations of measures, and if they coincide in a yellow box, the designer must provide a construction detail. If they coincide in an orange box, the designer must provide compatible specifications. So that might be, for instance, between heating system output and insulation level, or ventilation system capacity and air tightness. If they coincide in a green box, there's no interaction, no need to worry. If they can coincide in a red box, you shouldn't be doing those things together. They're non-compatible measures. So to summarize PAS 2035, before I run out of time, we have a retrofit coordinator required for every project to protect the customer's interest and the public interest and to manage the agreed intended outcomes. We have a risk assessment, which determines the path through the PAS and the qualifications for the retrofit assessor and the retrofit designer. The more risky, the more qualified those people have to be. We have a whole dwelling assessment, which includes the context, the condition, the occupancy, the energy performance, and the ventilation of the dwelling. It's far more than an EPC assessment or even a Green Deal assessment. We have requirements for design, which depend on the path and based on the improvement of option evaluation and the medium-term plan. There are additional requirements for traditionally constructed and protected buildings. All designs have to include provision for proper moisture management, and whenever whenever the existing ventilation is assessed as inadequate and any insulation is being added, a ventilation upgrade is required. Installation must comply with PAS 2030 and includes the testing, commissioning and handover process. And then finally, we have an evaluation process which is designed to confirm the agreed outcomes, investigate discrepancies, and also investigate unintended consequences, whether they're good or bad. So that's a very quick rundown through each home counts and PAS 2035. I'll skip the questions because I'm sure they'll come later, and I'm going to hand over now to David Pierpoint. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I'm just going to take over, I think. I hope.
Yeah, I've stopped sharing now.
Thank you. Okay. Hopefully you see my presentation on screen. Good afternoon, late afternoon to everybody. One of the comments on the chat there was, this all sounds very expensive. You hear that quite a lot. We also hear, this sounds very complicated, and we hear that quite a lot too. And both of those statements are true to an extent. They are more expensive and more complicated than the previous way of things. But we have another famous saying at the Retrofit Academy, which is that retrofit isn't rocket science, but it is complicated, because you're dealing with buildings and you're dealing with people. You're dealing with building science, and you're dealing with the way in which people then use those buildings. So there is a degree of complexity about it, but no more complex, I'll put it to all of you, than any other form of construction, the way in which we approach other forms of construction. It's only relative to how we've gone about doing retrofit over the last few decades. And the consequences of that, you know, the 10% failure rate on solid wall insulation projects is multi-millions of pounds worth of failings. Going back and remediating projects that fail or were never fit for purpose 20 years later, because we're going to have a rush on for the carbon budget for 2050, is going to cost us far more in the long term. So I think we have to be quite broad-minded in the way we think about it. Andre and Peter have told you about this stuff. I won't dwell on that. I'll tell you a bit about us. The Retrofit Academy is a community interest company set up in 2016, so right at the very, very bottom of the market, I think it would be fair to say. We have been delivering retrofit coordinator training, which Peter mentioned there. We developed that qualification, a level 5 diploma in retrofit coordination and risk management. We're now doing it to over 500 people, and we have over 150 graduates from that program. We're now working with those graduates, one of whom is Peter Bates himself, to help them take retrofit coordination into effective practice. And that's a program that BEIS are supporting us in. So it's a very well-established course now. It's improving all the time and been brought in line with all the new standards and fully up to date. We also support the industry to start putting the PAS into practice. We have a very simple mission statement, which is all about putting the PAS into practice. We have a membership of, primarily these are organisations involved in the eco sector, because that's where you are required to operate under Trustmark and the PAS 2035 standards from next June, and many of these companies are already delivering to those standards. So we provide day-to-day practical support guidance to those organisations. We developed tools and software that they use. We bring them together as working groups. We talk through common problems and challenges. We write guidance for them where they identify that they need more support, and so on and so forth. So we provide that sort of technical and procedural support to that sector. This is an initiative we launched only a couple of months ago, I think 3 months ago now, and we're up to 110 members, a mixture of organisations and individuals, and it's going very well. So we're all about both creating the theoretical understanding of buildings, building physics, you know, managing these moisture risks, ensuring that you deliver the thermal performance you set out to achieve, understanding the fabric first approach and why you have to consider fabric, services and renewables as one part of a whole house retrofit, not in isolation from one another. You know, so we teach the industry this theory. It's theory that sadly many people coming out of construction training in terms of further education and indeed higher education have a big gap around that knowledge. So very few people have received a good education in that stuff, hence there's a need for training like ours. There's then an even bigger gap between that theory and practice, because this has never been done before. It's new. Russell Smith's following on from me, I think, and he's likely to tell you that we're facing the greatest engineering challenge in our history, and he's absolutely right. Okay, we've never decarbonised our housing stock before. We'll probably never have to do it again on the same scale. So it's one of the great challenges of our age, and it's no surprise that we need to revolutionise the industry and support it to do that. Just to give you some sense, and Russell will probably talk in more detail around these figures, we do not have the skills and we do not have the people to deliver on the type of scale that we need. 27 million retrofits by 2050 is one thing. 12 million retrofits to just get to the band C level by 2030. Russell's research found that we need an additional 400,000 people to do that. These are not people who are currently in the sector. We have skill shortages already, chronic skill shortages already. You try and find a good plumber or electrician or a carpenter or a dry liner. So these need to be new people attracted into this new sector. So we've got a big old challenge there to both attract these people and then to train them properly. So I've more or less stuck to time. There's some big challenges, and I think you're now going to hear from Russell about Retrofit Works. Is that right, Russ?
I don't think it's me now.
I think it's, yeah, if I could intervene, I think it's Andrew Parkin who's on next. Thank you, David, for keeping to time. Okay. Russell, if you could keep us going to time in the same fashion, that would be terrific. Over to you, Russell, from a Retrofit Works. Sorry, to Andrew, I beg your pardon.
I didn't necessarily want to step in there just in case Russell wanted to dive in, so but that's fine. I'm going to share my screen now with everybody, so if you just bear with me.
Just whilst Andrew's doing that, do keep the questions going. I'm making a note of them and I will raise those in the Q&A at the end. Thank you, everybody. Andrew, over to you.
Okay, well, hopefully everybody can see my screen and my presentation. If there's a little black square up in the top left-hand corner, I apologise. I'll try and make that as small as possible, but I'm running off one screen here. Yes, hello, my name's Andrew Parkin from Stroma Certification and from PEPA, that's the Property Energy Professionals Association. and I'm here to talk about ensuring quality of retrofitting. Now, I feel like I think a lot of what I'm going to say has been said, to be fair. Quality is absolutely key. There are challenges ahead, and I think that as David has just alluded to, and what Russell's going to be talking about later, so I don't want to overlap too much, but we're going to go from a market which is sort of this size, a few billion quid being spent a year on various different incentives or owner-occupied, private owner retrofit that's already going on at the moment in different versions, different levels of quality, and we need to get it to something that's much, much bigger, that can deliver at scale, at pace, without affecting quality. So that's sort of, I think, one of the underpinning principles. And as an industry, we all want to take that journey together. So we need to work together in order to do that. Yes, there's some cost associated with that, but the long-term outcomes and objectives are the things that should be pushing us forward. So the question is, how do we go from where we are now to where we need to be, whilst taking quality forwards, improving all the time, and making it part of what we do? Well, it also just really started, and again, it's a bit of a history lesson, and I don't want to go into it too much detail because we don't have time, but it started with a review of what had happened with Eco, with Green Deal, and anything prior to that as well. And it was undertaken by a chap called Dr. Peter Bonfield, and that identified sort of 14 key recommendations, I think it was, through the Each Home Counts review. Trustmark have been an organisation in place for a number of years, and they were awarded the quality mark provision to look after the quality mark for a quality scheme going forward. And that was is really where PAS 2035 was born out of. And so when we look at how we deliver PAS 2035, we also look back at Each Home Counts and the recommendations that come from that as well. So I won't go into any sort of the further histrionics of it. I'll just look at what Trustmark are providing at the moment and how that sort of starts to bring some quality in from the framework that they've got together. So there is this principle of a master license agreement, which is given to Trustmark by BAYS, and Trustmark then award sub-licenses, and using their operating framework, they provide these sub-license agreements to scheme providers, one of which is Stroma certification, for example. We have a license to operate a retrofit assessor and retrofit coordinator schemes. And there are sub-licenses for installer schemes as well, and there are a number of installer schemes out there. The core part of that is the code of conduct, which the schemes, we have to ensure that our members, through our sub-licensing process, our members sign up to that code of conduct. And the idea behind that is to ensure that the consumer is protected, that the consumer charter, the customer charter is within that code of conduct as well, and that our members operate within the framework set by Trustmark. So it's an overarching framework. The core part of what we do as schemes, and where a lot of the quality quality assurance comes from, is through PAS 2035, which is something that we've already had a look at in some detail. So I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but I'm going to pluck out key parts of that. The specification was launched last year, and came into being through ECO on the 1st of January of this year. PAS 2035, as Peter has said, is an overarching standard. It's a process, effectively, that looks at whole house retrofit. So it looks at not just the installation of a single measure, but how multiple measures, an entire dwelling, can be upgraded to a high standard with quality at its core. Trustmark are there as an overarching compliance function as well, making sure that the PAS is being applied correctly, and they do that through the roles that are effectively within the PAS. So I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. At the moment, PAS 2035 is in place for eco, but it isn't just for eco. It's designed to work for the entirety of domestic retrofit. There is another standard coming out in the future called PAS 2038, which is designed for commercial buildings, and effectively will do a very similar thing to what PAS 2035 has in place. The PAS itself, 2035, must be used in conjunction with another standard called PAS 2030-2019, which succeeded an older version of that standard this year, and that used to be called PAS 2030-2017. They both exist at the moment. At this point in time, there is a transition phase between the two, and that is used for the installation of measures. So if you have loft insulation or cavity wall insulation installed, you do that through your through a competency scheme, and PAS 2030-2019 or 2017 is applied. It also works with other frameworks, as Peter had said earlier. The key thing about PAS 2035, and again this has been mentioned, is that there is a role in it called retrofit coordinator, and effectively they act like a project manager. They're responsible for ensuring PAS 2035 compliance. They protect the client's interests, they protect the public's interest. They act as a liaison with the client, the homeowner, the occupant, and also through the process, they deal with the other roles within the process and the other requirements of the standard as well. We'll have a look at that in a little bit of detail in the next few slides. I just wanted to just recap over those roles. So we have a coordinator, which is a certified role that looks after the whole process. There was a role, or there is a role called retrofit advisor, but in reality, advice occurs throughout the entire process, and it should. Advice is so important. It's important that the consumer is advised correctly throughout the process on how to use their property, how to ventilate their property, how not to ventilate their property, for example, how to use the systems that and technologies that are going to be installed in their property. There's also a role called retrofit assessor, which effectively starts the process once we have some intended outcomes, some initial discovery phase done. We have a risk assessment done on the property to work out what risk category that property is, and we'll have a quick look at that. So PAS A, B and C, A being the least risky, C being the highest risk. And once we've got a risk assessment, we start the process, and an assessor will assess the property. It's a holistic view, a holistic assessment of the property. So it will be how the property uses the energy, and how efficient the energy efficiency is of that property, how the property is being used by the current occupant, the condition of the property, because that's key as well. And then we look at ventilation and also historical significance as well, if you're dealing with traditional or protected buildings. Once the assessment is done, the coordinator will then work with the occupant, the homeowner, to produce an improvement option evaluation or a medium-term plan, depending on the risk paths we're going through. And there will be further advice at that stage. And then a design for the measures that are being installed. And not all the measures have to be installed at once, but the design needs to incorporate, as Peter had said, just to look at what measures are being installed and in what order to make sure that those measures are being installed correctly. The installation then occurs through another certified role called retrofit installer, and that's through PAS 2030-2019, and that involves installation testing, commissioning and handover, and some advice at the end as well for the homeowner to understand how to use their property now it's been upgraded, the measures that have been installed, what to do, what not to do. And then there's a process of monitoring and evaluation, which becomes a feedback loop, so that we can understand if there's been success or failure, or a combination of things happening at the property. That helps a coordinator understand what's worked, what hasn't worked in that instance. But the way I look at it, I look at it as an opportunity for everybody in the process, from the coordinator, the installer, the assessor, the schemes involved, and Trustmark, to learn from the process. The more we do at this, the better we get at it.
Andrew, sorry to interrupt. Andrew, sorry to interrupt. Quite a complex process. Just one more minute, please, to keep us to time. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. There are some documentation available on the Trustmark website that talks about the process and the roles within it. But as Peter said, the more complex the the process, the more complex the project, the more qualifications and the more parts of the process need to be done. And it's sort of like an A plus B plus C. So if you do everything for path A, if you're doing path B, you need to do A plus B, for example. I'm not going to go through these in any detail, but they are there available for people to look at, even if you don't have at this stage. And there is an overview of how the roles work together and what qualification or what role you do, what part of the process as well. So if you're interested, have a look on the Trustmark website. I think somebody else might talk about the data warehouse, but the data warehouse is where the magic happens. So all the documentation and all the evidence that we need to quality assess and quality assure the project ends up on the data warehouse, and it's the single point of truth for anybody, and it's also there for the consumer as well, so they've got that documentation and that information should they need it, when they need it. And then the final slide is that Trustmark has taken over responsibility for financial protection for the consumer, approved insurance provision and policy guarantee, and also inclusion on a central approved policy register as well. So they do things like the Trustmark board, the oversight panel, and an industry-led assessment panel, which some of the people here today are members of. So I think I've overrun. Thank you for listening. I am around at the end if anybody want to talk more. Thank you very
much. Okay, it's over to Russell. If people could keep their mutes on because we're getting some interference. But Russell, you now do have your 7 minutes of fame. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Just going to boot up my screen. Okay. I guess you might. One of the things you might want to think about my presentation as is coming at it from the other direction. All the fantastic work that's been done over several years now to put together the framework that's been described over the last few slides, I've kind of been watching with one eye. What I decided to do 15 years ago was renovate my own home when I discovered that the industry was a bit of a shambles. Having renovated it, understood exactly what was needed, I started to put together a few services that would help all the 3,000 people that came to have a look at my house. So it's kind of a bit of an organic approach to life, really, and I started my own company to do that, Quality Projects, which is an impartial advisor to people that have to make big decisions, whether they be in one house or 100,000 houses. And after a few years, we decided that Retrofit Works was something we would start, which is a not-for-profit cooperative to support all the organisations that really want this market to exist. And in one sense, our mission was to try and make that market exist, whether or not government decided to do anything. Hence why I've had one eye on the regulations and everything else that's been coming along, because really the key thing from my perspective as an organisation like Retrofit Works, which is ended up as a Trustmark organisation that does all of the things that everybody else has described, is really wanted to do it by taking a lot of people on a journey with us. Because on the one hand, when you look at a picture like this, you can say to yourself, okay, well, all of these buildings, they all need the same thing, don't they? Great, we'll start at the bottom, work our way up to the top, everyone will be happy. Well, every individual dwelling we'll do within this country is completely unique. And we need to look at it from that perspective in order for us to deliver the 27 million home refurbishment plan that we need in order to mitigate man-made climate change. If you look at this particular picture, this is 40 houses, all in Sutton in South London, where I'm from. The pie is the size of it is relative to the annual carbon emissions, and where those emissions come from, according to that key you can see on the left. There is no one pie there that's like any other. So if you go, and they're all buildings, by the way, that were built around about the same time, around about 1900, all the same house type. Victorian terrace, and in effect, there's no way you could go to them with a one-size-fits-all plan. So our challenge is that we need to come up with a way of helping every individual homeowner to go on their particular journey in a way that gets them to zero carbon as quickly as possible, but trying to do it in a standardised way because it reduces the cost. It's bloody hard. So if we want to understand how that happens, we need to understand that this is not something that's going to happen in one hit. I think a lot of people are assuming that we can get into every house and do the whole house top to bottom, but that would require us to start setting up temporary hotels in a local recreation park where somebody's going to be told to just go and live for 2 months and they'll come back and their house is beige and you can sort it out, mate. effectively we've got to be in a position where we can start to say to ourselves, we work in a circular fashion, and every single intervention in a property will end up with something that will probably come back round that loop at some point in the future. I did my whole house top to bottom. It was a very painful experience, and I lived on my own. If you're living with a family, expecting them to put up with something in one hit is going to be very hard. So we have to think about it in terms of us having almost like an asset management strategy. We have to understand that that loop has to have training. We will do things wrong. Let's make sure we don't do those things again. When we're planning a job, we can't assume that the house will not change. There'll be extensions. New things will be done for the layout. Finance will definitely play a part. We haven't got the money sitting around waiting for that to happen in our banks, personal banks rather. The finance provider will wish to see some kind of specification. We can't just give someone an EPC and expect a builder to know what to do with it. All sorts of different types of contractors. We have a whole bunch of things going on out there now where the contractor, if they're working under a competent person scheme or even past 2030, will sign off their own work and say it's wonderful. So we need a work quality regime. We need the performance of that house to be part of that, so people can see that they've made a genuine difference to the performance of their building, be it energy bills or air quality, so that we can feed that back into the training, and so we go around that loop again. But one problem we have in our industry is this line exists. The people on the right are biased, the people on the left are impartial, and all those people work within that model together and trying to do that in harmony. For that model to work well, for every person in their industry to be able to pitch that to 27 million homes, if the householders to buy that, we have to come up with a model that everyone can trust. If we have no trust in the model, we're all screwed. So basically, we have to be able to make sure that there is a model that makes that work. And that's what Retrofit Works is basically trying to do. We have customers that are not necessarily aware of the options. They don't necessarily have the confidence in the supply chain to make that work either. And by and large, you've got contractors that really don't think householders want to buy it, so they're not offering it. And I've never come across a contractor that deliberately wants to do a bad job. So this whole issue about quality is actually about just, unfortunately, it's just ignorance. They've not necessarily been trained. They don't have a regime that tells them off if they do wrong. And on this as well, we have advocates, great organisations, sustainable charities or community energy co-ops, Citizens Advice Bureau, landlords even. These guys want this market to exist, but they don't know how to engage with the supply chain. So Retrofit Works sits in the middle of all this, and it's a multi-stakeholder cooperative owned by those two kinds of members, the advocates and the practitioners. They all own an equal share, and we're trying to create that market together. And lo and behold, there is finance out there, lots of it, mostly sitting around doing nothing at the moment, depreciating every day. And these people, if they believe there is a model that they can rely on, they will lend. So the key thing from my perspective, coming at it, as I say, from a completely different angle to the great models that we have in the marketplace now.
Russell, just sorry, just to interrupt, just 1 minute, please. We're running up against time. Thank you.
Right. Okay. In effect, we're working with people like Gary on the left, who's an electrician who learned to put internal wall insulation in. And we're learning to understand that underfloor insulation needs to be put in at the same time as floorboards being lifted, so that we're thinking about this from an asset management perspective, not just from saying we're going to throw a bunch of measures at an industry and hope that people look at our app and buy them at the end of it. So the whole house plan is absolutely critical. And this is where the retrofit coordinator comes in. The person that instigates this whole house plan is saying, okay, well, you can only afford to do certain things, the things at the top of the list that you can do right now, but ultimately we want to be in a position where all of it will be done eventually. But if you do the wrong things first, you're blocking everything else. And this is where the retrofit coordinator comes in, where PAS 2035 will come in and oversee all of that stuff from start to finish, hopefully. So I'll leave you with this slide, which in effectively how Retrofit Works operates. All of the advocate organisations that are out there, they represent a whole bunch of people that might have lots of different motives for doing the same piece of work in their home. So that piece of loft insulation will have multiple benefits, and different organisations will interact with different people that have benefits to all those particular measures. They join, we vet the supply chain that come on board as a trustmark scheme. We can help all those organisations to come through the process so that they can get PAS 2030 and access the new Green Homes Grant, but we insist on having a machinery which includes a retrofit coordinator, a tendering portal so that each householder can get 3 quotes, and critically, all of those advocates and practitioners in the model can get access to training and CPD continually, because we will never be perfect. I've got shed loads more to say, but I've got to stop early. So happy days, everybody.
Thank you, Russell. Over to Akhtar, who's got just 5 minutes to talk about design, please.
Well, that's okay. So I don't have any slides, so unfortunately you're going to have to look at my face while I'm speaking, so sorry about that. I come from a very similar background to Russell, where I was interested in retrofitting a home and saw how difficult it was. I had no background whatsoever in the retrofit or building industry and couldn't believe how difficult it was to get things done. So I and a colleague of mine, Tom, worked on his house first because he pulled the short straw, and we designed and delivered the first passive house retrofit in the country for a private home, and that was 10 years ago almost exactly. That house has 6 people living in it and still has bills of £250 a year to heat, cool and light, and there's still nothing wrong with it. And the way we achieved that performance was by making sure that we designed it properly. So I'm here to talk to you about the importance of design, and the reason why we design, the reason why all of the stuff that has preceded me is because it all leads to the importance of a design and a process. The reason that design is so important is that it minimises the risk and it maximises performance. And what do we mean by risk? There are some people on this call who are much more qualified at talking about the risks than me, but roughly, if you put the wrong insulation in with the wrong walls, you'll get condensation, you'll damage the fabric, you will impact the beautiful architectural nature of our buildings. If you don't ventilate, you will cause mold and condensation and lead to an unhealthy indoor environment. If you don't think about the temperature in the house, it will cause it to overheat or be too cold. And as we have seen with grave consequences recently, the failure to design all this could has impact on fire safety of the buildings. What do we mean by performance? Well, at my company Inhabit, we talk about 3 things. We are talking about cost, comfort and carbon. There've been some comments in the chat I have seen about return on capital and how many years it's going to take to pay back, but that's missing the 2 other benefits of good quality retrofits, which are that we make the homes more comfortable, so they are warm in the winter, they are cool in the summer, and they have fresh air all year round. And also obviously the carbon savings, which are, if retrofit is done properly, they're repeated on an annual basis and they are guaranteed. So unlike, you know, putting cycle paths and things where you don't know whether people are using them, the carbon savings with this kind of work will deliver year on year, provided that it's done properly. And it's in all of our interest to make sure that this happens, because that's why we're all here. So I'll just break down those 3 components a little bit further. In terms of cost, we obviously do look at return on initial cost, but we look at whole life costs, which includes maintenance and management of that. We look at comfort, which I've just explained, and in this market, having healthy indoor air quality is going to become much more important. And in our industry, we're tying ourselves up in knots between embodied carbon and in-use carbon, but it's the whole piece. And if you design a building properly, it will look at all of those things. The consequences of failure to manage all of these things are the points that people have raised earlier, which are we don't get the carbon savings that we're spending all this money on. The taxpayer is about to invest a huge amount in this at a very difficult time, and we've got to make sure that we achieve value for money for them, which is getting our carbon savings. And it lets down the entire industry. Now, at the beginning of this talk, we talked about the Green Deal and the impact it had on our industry, and we are still feeling those impacts. People don't trust our industry. The Green Deal had the 3rd highest number of nuisance calls within 2 years of its operation. And that means that it's much, much harder for people to believe me when I tell them that when we design our homes, they actually work. So I suppose I'm ending with a call to action for all of us to make sure that we take responsibility as an industry to comply with PAS 2035 and make sure that it has teeth. When we find that PAS 2035 and the whole retrofit coordinator process has not been followed, we report it to relevant authorities, and also we take responsibility to do a good job. And now the most important piece is the installers, because they have to do what we design, and I'm going to pass over to Kevin to talk to you about that.
Thank you, Akhtar. Just going to share my screen with everyone. Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can, Kevin. Thank you.
Okay. So Ecolution, basically we're a specialist installer, founded in 1999, so we've been doing this a hell of a long time, and we've probably experienced most of the frustrating things that have already been highlighted in these talks. I will tell you what we do. I'll give you some of my opinion on what can be done and what should be done. And it might upset some people as well, so we'll see how that goes. So just to give you a little bit, I'm going to really mainly focus on air source heat pumps. I think that's going to be the main technology of heat generation for the next decade. So to talk a little bit about that. And the background picture there is our training centre. Why have we as an installer got a training centre? Because it's been highlighted already, there's a lack of training. There's been a lack of investment in our industry for a long time. We know this has been coming for a while, but you just can't go and get training and you can't upskill people at the moment. So we train people, mainly our own engineers, but some of our clients as well, in the technologies of the future. But I'll be quite honest, those technologies of the future are here already. So our services, I'll just pass on from that. Okay. So planning, like any good retrofit project, you've got to plan for it, any project at all. So it's a well-used saying, you know, fail to plan, plan to fail, but we do see lots of things being rushed. And if I'll be quite honest, the Green Homes Grant Scheme is basically coming very quickly at us. As an industry, as a sector, it's already been highlighted, we have not got enough people. It's being rushed. And bluntly, I don't think we've planned for this well enough. And I would see some quality issues coming in the future. Programming works is an obvious one again. We've got to program the works. To do that, we have to engage with the supply chain, the labour resource, and also deal with planning and building permissions required. In many projects that we've dealt with in the past, there's all been good intentions, but somewhere along the line, i.e. a planning department may come along and say, no, you can't do that. No, we want this information, and suddenly you're out of time for that project if it's got deadlines. So planning needs to start very early and understand all the kind of consequences of what you're going to face. So even with air source heat pumps, you're not going to be able to put them in many conservation areas. There's been, I'll mention it later on, but there's been a statement from the Mayor's office, the Mayor of London's office, that 80% of all the houses in London at the moment will still be here in 2050. How do we retrofit them? Well, a lot of those houses are in conservation areas and listed buildings. Let's start dealing with that now. Ask the question how we deal with those, because that's the difficulty to challenge, to tackle. Stakeholder engagement, again, some of this has been mentioned, but we need to kind of inform the end user from the outset about the technologies, the manufacturers, what they're going to get, what they can expect to receive, explain how the systems work. We do a lot of retrofits, or have done a lot of retrofits for housing associations, and we don't get to talk to the tenants before we start the schemes. We don't get to communicate what they're getting. An air source heat pump is different from a gas boiler. An air source heat pump is different from an oil boiler. It basically works different. It works at lower temperatures. You don't get warm radiators. The most common call we get is my radiators are not warm enough. It's never been explained to them why. So, and that creates a call, creates an after sale issue. So communication, stakeholder engagement, we find is really important if we can do it, basically. If properties are occupied, then we need clear engagement of the occupiers regarding the program of works and the areas of work. Again, we find this is not explained to the occupiers of properties very well from the outset. So in a way, coming back to the planning, you're almost planning to fail because you're not engaged with these people, and they don't know the outcomes, how the work's going to be proceeding. And one of the earlier speakers said about putting everyone in a car park for a couple of weeks. But if you're going to do that, at least tell them, kind of thing. You know, that's the kind of thing we've got to do. Preparation of work areas, health and safety, protection of people, protection of, you know, we've got COVID now to deal with. So how are we dealing, how are we going to people's properties? How are we preparing for that? So these are all very important parts. And the other thing is coordination with other trades. There's likelihood you're going to be working with other trades, or you need to coordinate with other trades. Market size. We've done some of our own market size. We've based this on the figures the government have just given us for 600,000 homes to be affected by the £2 billion grant, and said that's 2/3. We've come up with a market size, if it's evenly split, of around 11.6 billion for the next 3 or 4 years, and up to 15 billion a year. That's a hell of a lot of money. And if we're going to ensure quality, we need an army of quality inspectors. Because one of the things we find is that, you know, we mentioned the Green Deal, but no one checks this work. We're not checked. We haven't had as a business, we haven't had a visual inspection of our work for 7 years, even though we're MCS and accredited for a number of bodies. We do the paperwork, people check our paperwork, no one goes to site and physically checks the work that's been done. And I think if you really want this to work, you've got to get in your cars, on your bikes, on your trains, and go and inspect the work. So, and that would be something we would strongly recommend. Again, this is about market size and focus on heat pumps. We know there's other technologies, but heat pumps are one of the primary technologies that are going to be used, basically. And again, coming to what we talked about earlier, Martin, there's over 12 million houses that need to be retrofitted to grade C in the next decade. 12 million, we got kind of, well, by 2030, so we got 9 years to do that, and we've not really started yet. So we're at the bottom of that hockey stick. How are we really going to upskill people, train people, and to deliver this? This is a massive opportunity. And don't get me wrong, I'm not criticising anything. I really want this to work, but I do think I don't think we've really learned from some of the things we've done in the past. And whilst we've got lots of good intentions with PAS 2035, but I'm just sitting here listening as an installer. Which PAS am I working to, guys? Is it 2030-17, 2030-19, 2030-35, plus MCS, plus such and such? That is overcomplicated for any installer. You know, we're not known for being clever people. We install things, you know, so we need to simplify that. And how will the end stakeholder, i.e. the homeowner, how will they understand that? So how do we simplify that? I firmly believe in all of it, don't get me wrong, but how do we translate that into a common language that can be used by someone on site, that can be used by smaller companies than mine that haven't got the infrastructure to deal with that? Because you're going to need every size company to deliver this. So how do we translate this into a much simpler way of communicating things? Quality control. So again, this is what we're kind of talking about: MCS accreditation, Trustmark accreditation. I'd also bring in manufacturers' requirements, because if we install things wrong, you invalidate warranties. So you then get costs coming on. Building regs, as I mentioned, you've got building regs to deal with, planning regs to deal with. Strongly would recommend on-site audits, not just, and again, I'm not criticising it, you know, but data warehouses are great, but that's me submitting the data. Unless someone's got physical proof we've actually done the work properly, you've got all the paperwork, and the paperwork, I can assure you, will be very good. So how do we deal with that? End user education, again, that is very important to us, because if you don't train people how to use their systems, what we do, if we're doing a large retrofit, we'll find some super users on the estate and train them so they can help new people coming onto the estate and they can hand over. But we do need to invest a lot of time in training end users. Qualifications, again, an earlier slide, we've got to train, I can't remember the number, but I think it's over 250,000 new engineers into the marketplace. And we've already got a shortage of trades. You know, to get a good engineer, if you start training now, that would be 3 years to do a basic plumbing, electrical, refrigeration course. And then you've got to upskill them to a heat pump. How are we doing that when that will take us 250,000 of our workforce can't really start work for 4 years? So we're already struggling here to make this work. So qualifications, who's going to check the qualifications of the companies, the engineers, etc. So my company can be qualified with Trustmark or MCS and many other accreditations, but who's checking the engineers? You're relying on us to check the engineers, and we know other companies will just get someone off the street to do this, basically. And again, communication is, how do we communicate this? You know, it's not being communicated very much to the public at the moment. I've not seen any adverts on the TV. I've not seen anything going on at the moment is how the public get this. We know social landlords have applied for their vouchers and registered for the schemes. And we also know a lot of social landlords have not, because a lot of them are still on furlough or working from home. So the people we talk to, there's not been what I call an overwhelming feedback from our clients, because they don't either know about it or they've not been empowered to register for the scheme at the moment. Design properly. Again, this is really important, and I know it's an obvious one. We're already seeing systems going in that are not designed properly. We're seeing retrofit programs where people are taking an oil boiler out and putting the air source heat pump in. They're not upgrading controls, they're not upgrading cylinders, not upgrading radiators. So it comes back to they are destined to fail, because the radiators won't get warm enough in the winter, the water won't get hot enough, and it won't be controlled properly. So i.e. there's a misinterpretation from some people that heat pumps are a direct replacement for a gas or oil boiler. They are not. You have to look at the whole system. You have to resize the system and basically educate. In this occasion, it'll be educate for us, it'll be the social landlords. They do not understand how a heat pump works or what they're meant to do. They think they are hitting programs by just swapping out technologies. It doesn't work like that, and it's destined to fail. But design is the most important thing for us. We start off with a good design, we can deliver a good project. If there's no design to work for, there's no accountability.
Just another minute, please, Kevin.
Yeah. Okay, so nearly at the end. So again, really important for us is handing over the system properly, but also building into the offering is the maintenance regimes. Again, if the end client doesn't understand how to maintain or what to maintain, the technologies are going to fail. And just to give you a little idea, a gas boiler has around about 30 parts in it. A heat pump has about 350 parts in it. It has to be maintained, and you have to have maintenance regimes if you're going to get the whole life of this of these working properly. And that's lessons learned, so I can talk about those later on. So hopefully on time, Martin, for you.
Terrific, Kevin. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Over to you now, Martin, as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you, of course, to all of the speakers. We've gone a little bit over, but we've got time for 10-15 minutes for questions. I've got a list of half a dozen questions that have popped up in the chat box, which I'll go through first. These are the ones that I don't think have been answered by other people. Thanks to those that have answered those other questions. And the only other qualification I'll say, if somebody has a question, they could please just state their name and organisation, and then a question rather than another presentation, please. So the first one, going back to Andre at the outset, I think you mentioned, Andre, just to set the context, 2 billion to be spent. Rishi's keen to spend 2 billion between September and March. Rob Wilkinson is asking, with COVID, what is the likely take-up rate?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be glib or flippant, but it's very hard to say. So, two uncertainties, obviously the demand, firstly, which is hard to judge. The Green Deal Home Improvement Fund, which was much smaller, was, well, in terms of demand at least, it was a big success, in as much as the vouchers were quite famously at the time, in one tranche of them, they went in less than 24 hours. But we had 3 tranches, and we adapted, we basically reduced the price of those, and by the end there was a much more normal stream of applications. I do worry, I worry probably less about the demand and more about the supply chain. And I know people in the chat have raised that, and it's been one of those things that's an unknown, and I think this is the dilemma. This was all about economic stimulus, and the Chancellor was not interested in sort of sensible conservative estimates of what can be delivered. So we had been arguing that retrofit was the right thing for economic stimulus because it's labor intensive, It's generally SMEs, local economies getting boosted. But we were aware that we would prefer to start slowly and build up. He was not interested in that because this is a crisis. He wanted things of billions, to put it frankly. So had we said, well, actually we can't do this, we can't deliver large amounts, and I mean we, the sort of royal we of industry, we could have ended up with nothing, and that might have been damaging in the longer term. So I think we were always aware that this is risky, and and what we've raised with Treasury from the start is that we don't think it is deliverable, but we need, or rather we need the flexibility so that delivery, actually installation, can go into next year. Okay. So part of that 2 billion will be local authority delivery, which can go into next year, and we'll just have to see. We'll just have to take a moment in sort of winter and see what's going on to see how much flexibility for that spending we can get.
Okay, I hope it's better than the old Green Deal, which I recall 8 years ago had a very slow start at one of our events. I remember somebody asking the question, but let's keep moving on. Hermione has asked a couple of related questions. Does anybody know of any research undertaken with homeowners to have a look at their views and how the lack of quality in the past may have affected their confidence in then taking up some of these deals, like the one that we've just been talking about today, which is going to be launched at the end of the month? And related to that, would freely available information help as well? I think that could be Andre, it could be any of the earlier speakers in particular. Anybody wants to take that question up?
Yeah, I could take that, Martin.
Thank you.
Some good positives that came out of the original Green Deal were actually some quite interesting reports about user reactions and how it was best to deal with. So yeah, there have been a number of reports that have come out of the original Green Deal in that connection.
Okay, perhaps you could let Hermione make her aware of that. But I think there's a plea also that if there was a sort of an availability of freely available information to help people, that might also be useful. Just on then, moving on to PAS 2035, 2035, Martin Clark has said the process looks expensive, and somebody else mentioned it looks like it's £200 per PAS 2035 assessor or support person. And is that going to reach the right person? So these questions are all to do with cost. And is this PAS process going to be too expensive, and not least for those people that need it the most? Who would like to answer that one?
Martin, I'll come in there if I may. It's David here. The point about £200, I think, it related to how much buying PAS 2035 the standard was actually. I will share with the organisers of the event a discount code which we have, which you can actually get that for half that cost. So I've only had that today, and I'll pass it on. Just don't share it any more widely than this group, please. I touched on the additional cost of compliance, and it's undeniable that there will be an additional cost of compliance. You know, using a retrofit coordinator or employing a retrofit designer, or all these things will cost far more than we're used to spending on energy efficiency projects. But look what we've got for our money before. If you could, I had a conversation with an installer recently who was complaining that their customers wouldn't buy ventilation. And I begged them to explain to the homeowners that the alternative was to buy condensation. And when you put it in those terms, people are more than happy to spend money on ventilation. It's a cultural change, and we will get better and quicker the more we do this. So it will become cheaper the more we get into it and deliver at scale.
And who actually pays the 200 or the £100, David, to be clear?
Well, that's just a case of buying the standard. It's not obligatory that people buy the standard and read the standard. It's just that BSI choose to or do charge for it?
So it's the homeowner who would pay that if they wanted to have their house in that standard, as it were?
No. I think we're totally at cross purposes here. I'm obviously not explaining it very well. The homeowner will have no interest in PAS 2035 at all. That is a standard that applies to the industry. The industry need to have a copy of the standard so that they can apply it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Right. No, that's fine. Sorry. No, that's helpful. Thank you very much. And there's a question about whether we should instigate a passport system for homes whereby we will record and have a database of all of the installations which have taken place to improve the home over time. It almost takes us back to the EPC debacle of what was it, sort of a decade ago or something like that. And that was Nicole Alto asking that question. Anybody, any thoughts on a better database system for individual homes?
I can have a go at that if that's okay. It's Russell. Yeah, it doesn't take us anywhere near EPCs, thankfully, and EPCs have never been a debacle. They do exactly what they're designed to achieve. The idea of a passport system is that you have data that allows current and future owners to have access to what that building has installed and what the original intent of a retrofit coordinator was back at the start of the journey. So if I mentioned in my brief talk about being able to say that we could put a plan in place right at the start so that future owners, well, in fact, the initial plan does not block future opportunities, and that's exactly what this passporting process is meant to do. So if an owner that's only there for 5 years does one or two things, but there is a plan that has a list of 8 or 9 or 10 things that need to happen to get that house towards zero carbon, you just hand over that if you like, the passport to the next person, so it picks it up and takes it on. You know, one of the difficult things is GDPR and being able to navigate the regime in order to make sure the information is available from person to person, owner to owner. But it does work quite successfully in the car industry. If you go to a MOT place or garage, you know, they can log on to the stats of your home. And in fact, these days there are even sensors in the car that those guys can tap into to see how it's been performing. So it's not beyond the wit. We just have to accept that the house is not personal data. Unfortunately, people in government can't get their head around that either at the moment. So once we do, we've got a lovely thing. And the data warehouse at Trustmark is a really good place for that to start.
Yeah, I agree with that, Russell. I just want to step in there. I think it's, as much as anything, it's about not losing what we already know, and learning as much about a property before purchasing it, whilst you own it, updating that information. It just means that we make better choices. There are no alarms and no surprises when it comes to deciding what to do to upgrade that property as well. Yeah, and I think it's a stitch in time at the end of the day, isn't it? Mm.
Okay, yeah, thanks gentlemen both on that. I mean, I was with EPC, I wasn't referring to the programme itself, I was thinking more of the political debacle with a capital P at the time. A question from Catherine Canny-Pelly is, who will audit these installations as they take place? I think we heard from Kevin that remarkably have not been audited on site in 7 years. Anybody want to take that one?
Well, I'll happily step in on that one as well. Unfortunately, 7 minutes to talk about quality wasn't nearly enough, and I didn't quite get through everything I wanted to say. But there is auditing throughout the process, as the process is happening and at the end. And so a retrofit assessor will be audited on their assessment. Now that can happen within days of the assessment taking place before measures start being installed. The coordinator can be audited mid and end of process as well. An installer should be audited at the point of their competency being checked. But there is the monitoring and evaluation processes at the end as well, which is Trustmark are looking at how they can do this in the best possible way with risk at the heart of it all. So we start looking at high risk properties or known areas of risk, and focus on those areas whilst also randomly auditing other installations. And I think it all has to form part of a feedback loop as well, so that we all learn from the process. That's every practitioner involved, but also the schemes and Trustmark themselves as well, and how we can make the process better, or how we can better fit with what we're doing in PAS 2035. to improving the standard in the future. But I think you've got to do auditing, you've got to go on site, you've got to have a look. Otherwise, we will never find the problems and we'll never learn from those problems.
Can I add to that as well, please, Chair? Is that okay?
Please do, yeah.
So Retrofit Works is just starting up within the Cambridgeshire area, and the idea of the Retrofit Works model, given that we use retrofit coordinators for everything that we do, is that the retrofit coordinator's job, as well as overseeing the assessment and design process for each individual retrofit, is to make sure the contractor's doing their job properly. So we don't wait for the regimes that Andrew just set out are great for making sure the professionals are doing their thing, but the retrofit coordinator in our regime has eyes and ears on every single thing that happens. We've got an app-based program that all of our contractors have to use, and it's stipulated what things need to be recorded on the app, so that each that goes back to the homeowner and the retrofit coordinator and the auditor of the retrofit coordinator, so that everyone's got access to knowledge. So we've, in effect, we will go on a risk-based regime. We'll go and visit everything that looks awful. We haven't got, if we decided we were going to visit every single thing every single day, the householder wouldn't pay for it. So we have to find the right thing, right balance. And we think using the digital approach that we have found that a good balance. So we make sure that very little passes through the net. And when it does, as it always will, because nothing's perfect, we leap on it.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from James. Will the GHGs be accessed by individual customers directly? To what extent will retrofit persons be involved?
I'll have a go at that. The Green Homes grant, we could probably talk about for about 3/4 of an hour. But the idea is that the homeowner or the landlord, you can't do this if you're a tenant, but you can if you're a homeowner or a landlord. And you can get advice from the Simple Energy Advice website or another, whether that's a retrofit practitioner or other person within the industry that's able to give advice, and that starts the journey. You have to get quotes, and then you have to push those quotes through what will become a service run by the administrator that's appointed for the Green Homes grant. They haven't been appointed yet, and I'm sure Andrew could probably talk about that in more detail. And the money is paid at the point of installation sign-off. Again, that's my understanding at this moment in time.
I think the point James is making, because he does qualify it, sorry, is that a lot of homeowners he has spoken to don't have trust in the industry. And it strikes me, looking at this slightly from the outside, because we cover an awful lot of sectors in Cambridge Clean Tech, it looks as if that there's been issues in the past about trust and about quality of work. We've now got what could be a very, very good scheme coming up, and we've got all the quality control around it, that somehow we need to communicate and get that message across.
Yes, so the intent is that it's led, the demand is led by the householder, but in practice, and what we've seen before is that the installers get involved because it's easier for them to navigate the application process, and there's no inherent problem with that. I do agree with the campaign. I think in terms of letting people know, and it's something we are hoping to do. There's quite a lot of reticence across government because, for example, the Green Deal, which has been mentioned, there was a publicity campaign around that. It got criticised and it wasn't very successful, albeit the whole product was much more complex at the time as well. So we're having to do some persuading across Whitehall to spend money to publicise this and encourage people to take it up. And we'll see how that goes. And I think that will be, it's one aspect about the Green Homes grant. But as I mentioned earlier, I think government does need to get more involved. And something we will be considering is how can we persuade the public or inform the public about their role in decarbonising the UK, and houses or buildings are part of that. but it's, you know, it's that overall picture of how can we move to net zero.
Okay, terrific.
Can I just jump in and ask Andre a question about Green Homes Grant and more complex buildings? Are you able to say anything about that as yet?
So the intent is, and the detail will be set out by Trustmark, but the intent is that the park homes, traditional buildings, and high-rise will have to go through the new process. So PAS 2035.
Okay, I'm just conscious of time. We've overrun a little bit, but there's been plenty of discussion and plenty of chat in the chat box. So at this stage, I'd just like to, before asking either Cynthia or Oriane to take us through the next stages about the breakout or coffee rooms, I'll ask you in a second, but I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed to all of our speakers. I think it's going to be exciting times over the next 6 months, if not challenging times as well. We've got to get this message out and get people you know, moving in the right direction in terms of retrofit. We need it for the sake of the climate emergency. There's plenty of professionals on this call who you know the direction of travel and know what we need to do next. So it's a case of pulling forward together, I would suggest. But thank you very much indeed to all of the speakers. Cynthia or Oriane, would you like to just take the participants through how we're going to organise the breakout groups, which we'll do for 15 minutes?
I've opened all the rooms now. So for all the people who told us which room they wanted to be in, they just have to click on the bottom and they can join the rooms. Yeah, I can see that some people are joining already. For those who haven't, would you mind just sending a message in the chat section, just telling us which room they want to be assigned to? You can see which room, like which speakers goes in each room on your screen, and then I'll just assign you to the appropriate one. Yeah, okay, I see the things coming. Thank you.
Rain has sent a message for room 3. Martin, can I just check if you've received any requests to be assigned to a particular room? It's Martin disappeared.
And James is going to room number 1.
Ariane, can I just jump in while you're sorting things out on that side of things? Just a couple of announcements. The first thing, I want to thank everybody from the Cambridge Clean Tech team, particularly Ariane, who've done a great job in the background organising all this. And thank you to Martin for, and again, Cambridge Clean Tech for hosting this event. The next special interest group for the Sustainable Smart Homes will actually be on the now on the 28th of October. I'm still trying to organise the actual theme of that, but that will now be the next SIG group meeting, 28th of October. And then also in December, we're hoping to organise one which we have a focus around integrating electric vehicles into home energy systems. That was originally going to be in October, but we've had to delay it for various reasons. So please do. And if you're not already joined Cambridge Clean Tech, I'm going to give them a plug because I think you should be joining it, speakers and for that matter, or participants, if you want to be kept informed as what's happening. Thank you, Ari.